A stranger saw you for only 10 seconds, nothing more, no conversation, no introduction, no reason to remember you. And yet, something about that moment didn't stay normal in their mind. It didn't feel like a random pass-by anymore. It felt like something their brain paused on, even if they didn't realize it at the time. Because here's the strange part about human perception: most people never notice. We don't remember people because of time spent. We remember them because of impact density. In those first few seconds, the brain is not analyzing your life, your story, or your personality. It is scanning for signals, energy, posture, eye contact, movement timing, micro behaviors that happen faster than conscious thought can catch. And sometimes, without warning, a person creates a pattern break. Something doesn't fit the mental expectation the observer carries. You didn't say anything. You didn't try to stand out. You might not have even noticed them looking at you. But in their mind, something registered as different, even if they cannot explain what that difference was. That is where it begins, not in action, not in conversation, but in interruption. Because the human brain is designed to ignore most faces it sees, filtering them out instantly as background data. So when one single face refuses to be filtered, even for a second longer than necessary, it creates a small, unresolved signal. And unresolved signals don't disappear easily. They linger in the subconscious like unfinished thoughts, waiting for meaning that never comes. And in that silence of explanation, something subtle starts forming. A memory that feels bigger than the moment itself, even though it lasted only 10 seconds. After that moment passes, the stranger doesn't think much of it at first. They continue walking, return to their routine, scroll their phone, talk to someone, or get distracted by whatever life was already pulling their attention toward. On the surface, everything resets normally. But underneath that normality, something slightly unusual begins to happen. The brain, especially the subconscious layer, does not fully discard experiences that feel incomplete. It categorizes most people instantly as irrelevant background noise. But when something doesn't fit neatly into a category, it gets flagged without permission. Not as important, not as urgent, but as unresolved. And unresolved information is one of the strongest triggers for mental replay. So even though they are not consciously thinking about you, their mind starts to quietly revisit the moment without asking for permission. Not as a full memory at first, but as fragments. A face, a posture, a brief second of eye contact, or even just a feeling that something about that person was not entirely ordinary. And the strange part is, the brain does not immediately know what to do with that signal. It tries to assign meaning to it because the human mind is built to reduce uncertainty. It asks subtle internal questions like, why did that feel different? Why did I notice them more than others? Why does this feel slightly important even though nothing happened? But there is no concrete answer available because there was no conversation, no event, no defining moment to anchor the memory. And when the brain cannot anchor something logically, it begins to rely on emotional reconstruction instead. It fills in gaps using interpretation rather than fact. This is where the impression starts to deepen without external reinforcement. The stranger might not realize it, but their mind is slowly looping back to you in short, fragmented flashes throughout the day. Not in a dramatic way, not like obsession in the emotional sense, but like a background process that keeps reopening a file it cannot fully close. And every time it reopens that file, it tries again to categorize what it experienced. Was that confidence? Was that mystery? Was that distance? Was that presence? Was that something else entirely? But because there is no direct explanation, the mind keeps failing to finalize the classification. And failure to classify something cleanly is what causes mental persistence. The brain hates ambiguity, especially when it comes from social perception, because humans are wired to read people quickly for safety, trust, and predictability. So when a person doesn't fit the usual prediction model, the system keeps running checks in the background. Even while the stranger is doing completely unrelated things, a part of their mind will occasionally replay that brief encounter, trying to see it from a new angle, hoping that context will suddenly make it make sense. But context never arrives because there was no deeper interaction to build it from. And this is where the effect quietly strengthens. The less information there is, the more the brain tries to generate its own meaning. Over time, that single 10-second moment starts to feel longer in memory than it ever was in reality. Not because anything changed outside, but because the mind inside refuses to fully let it go. As time moves forward, something even more interesting begins to happen inside their memory. The raw moment doesn't stay frozen the way it actually occurred. It starts to shift, stretch, and reconstruct itself in subtle ways without them realizing it. This is how human memory works when something is emotionally unclear, but cognitively unresolved. The brain is not a recording device. It is a meaning-making system, so when it cannot find meaning in a moment, it slowly begins to build one. And in that process, details that were once neutral start to take on emotional weight they never originally had. That brief 10-second encounter, which was once just a passing glance, starts to feel slightly more significant in hindsight. Not because anything new happened, but because the mind keeps revisiting it, and each revisit adds a layer of interpretation. The face they saw might begin to feel more striking in memory than it actually was in real time. The silence might begin to feel deeper. The presence might begin to feel more noticeable, and the overall impression begins to take on a shape that wasn't consciously present during the moment itself. This is known as cognitive reconstruction, where memory is continuously edited by the brain to resolve unfinished emotional or perceptual patterns. And because there was no conversation, no closure, and no explanation, the mind has complete freedom to fill those gaps however it wants. So instead of reducing the significance of the moment, it often amplifies it. The stranger may start to recall you at unexpected times, but each recall is slightly different, as if their mind is testing new versions of the same memory to see which one makes sense. One version might make you seem more intense, another might make you seem more mysterious, another might make you feel more distant or unreadable. None of these versions are accurate in a literal sense, but all of them feel subjectively real to the person remembering. And this is where distortion begins to quietly shape perception. Because as the details fade, the emotional impression becomes the dominant element. The brain tends to preserve feeling over fact, especially when there is no factual anchor to stabilize the memory. So what remains is not what actually happened, but how it felt to experience something that could not be immediately explained. And feelings, unlike facts, tend to grow when they are revisited without resolution. Each time the memory resurfaces, the brain unconsciously adds emphasis to the parts it finds most emotionally confusing. This is why neutral moments rarely stay neutral in memory if they carry ambiguity. They either get discarded completely or elevated into something that feels more meaningful than it originally was. In this case, because the encounter was brief but impactful in an undefined way, it slowly gets upgraded in importance inside their mind. Not consciously but automatically. The stranger might not even realize that their perception is changing over time, because the process is gradual and invisible. But at some point, when they think back to that moment, it no longer feels like just someone I passed by. It starts to feel like someone I noticed for a reason I still can't fully explain. And that subtle shift is what strengthens the mental imprint, turning a simple encounter into something that occupies more psychological space than it logically should, simply because the mind cannot find a clean ending for it. As days pass, the encounter doesn't fade the way ordinary moments usually do. Instead, it begins to reappear in the background of their thoughts at unexpected times, not as a full memory with clear structure, but as fragments that surface without warning. It might happen during a quiet moment, while doing something completely unrelated, or even in the middle of another conversation when the mind briefly drifts. And each time it returns, it doesn't come back with clarity, it comes back with curiosity. The brain tries again to understand what it couldn't define earlier, and that repeated attempt creates what is known as a mental replay loop. This loop is not deliberate, it is automatic. The subconscious keeps reopening the same moment because it never received closure, and the absence of closure keeps it emotionally active, even when logically it should be forgotten. What makes this even more persistent is that there is no narrative attached to the memory. There was no conversation, no event, no conclusion, only a brief impression. And when the mind lacks a story, it tries to create one. So over time, it starts attaching meaning to the fragments it has, even if that meaning is inconsistent or shifting. One day, the memory might feel like a moment of curiosity. Another day, it might feel like a strange sense of recognition. And another time it might feel like something almost significant, but still out of reach. This inconsistency is exactly what keeps it alive, because the brain keeps trying to stabilize it into a single understandable interpretation. But without new information it keeps failing, and that failure results in repetition. The stranger might not even consciously realize they are thinking about it repeatedly. Instead, it shows up as a passing thought that feels slightly intrusive, like something uninvited but not strong enough to ignore. And the more they try to dismiss it, the more the mind quietly brings it back in softer forms, as if reminding them that the question has not been answered yet. This is how unresolved impressions gain psychological weight over time, not through intensity, but through persistence. The human brain is wired to resolve uncertainty, especially when it involves other people, because understanding others has always been linked to survival and social prediction. So when a person cannot be easily categorized, the mind treats them as an open loop. And open loops demand resolution, even when none is available. This is why the memory doesn't stay still. It keeps reactivating itself in small, fragmented ways, each time attempting a slightly different angle of understanding. And with every repetition, the emotional imprint becomes more familiar. Not because anything new has happened, but because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity often gets mistaken for significance. Over time, this leads to a subtle shift where the memory no longer feels like something external that happened briefly in the past, but something internal that feels oddly present, as if it still belongs somewhere in the mind's current awareness. The stranger may not be able to explain why it keeps returning, and they may not even label it as important, but the fact that it keeps resurfacing is enough to keep it psychologically active. And in that continuous loop of recall and reinterpretation, the moment that lasted only seconds begins to occupy far more mental space than its actual duration should allow, simply because the mind refuses to leave an unanswered pattern alone. In the end, what remains is not the actual 10-second moment itself, but the psychological imprint it leaves behind in someone who never expected it to matter. The stranger moves on with their life, continues their routines, meets other people, experiences other events, and yet something subtle continues to exist in the background of their awareness. Not loud enough to interrupt their day, but quiet enough to occasionally surface when the mind is unoccupied. And the strange truth is, they don't think about you as a full person with details, history, or identity. They think about you as an impression, a feeling without a clear explanation attached to it. This is where the mind creates something powerful from something minimal. Because when a person cannot fully categorize an experience, the brain doesn't discard it completely. It preserves it in an unfinished state. And unfinished experiences tend to resurface because the mind is constantly trying to reduce ambiguity in the world around it. Over time, that brief encounter becomes less about what actually happened and more about what it represented internally. It becomes a symbol of something they couldn't quite define in the moment and still cannot define even after reflection. And that lack of definition is exactly what gives it longevity. If it had been ordinary, it would have been forgotten within seconds. If it had been clear, it would have been categorized and stored without emotional weight. But because it was neither fully ordinary nor fully understood, it occupies a strange middle space in memory, something between irrelevant and meaningful, which the brain keeps revisiting in search of resolution. And as this quiet process continues, the stranger may occasionally wonder why that moment still comes back at all. Not in an obsessive or dramatic way, but in brief flashes of thought that feel unprompted. They might question whether they imagined its significance, or whether something about that moment was genuinely different from the rest of their day. But even those questions don't lead to answers, because the original moment did not contain enough information to solve itself. And so the loop continues, not as an emotional attachment, but as an unresolved perception that never reached a conclusion. What makes this effect so subtle is that it doesn't feel like thinking about a person. It feels like remembering a feeling without context. And feelings without context are difficult for the brain to dismiss because they don't have a clear end point. This is why the memory lingers longer than expected, not because the encounter was dramatic, but because it was incomplete. The mind naturally prefers closure, and when closure is missing, it quietly keeps the file open in the background, revisiting it from time to time to see if anything new can be extracted from it. But nothing new ever comes, only reinterpretation of the same fragments. And over time, even that repetition begins to fade in intensity, but not completely disappear. It settles into something softer, like a faint recognition that surfaces occasionally without emotional urgency, just curiosity without resolution. And that is the final state of the impression, not a memory that defines anything, not a moment that changes direction, but a quiet psychological trace that exists simply because the brain never found a satisfying way to close it.